Hello everybody, this is George from Ireland. Now this blue house behind me is the house where George Orwell lived briefly in the 1930s. So George Orwell was born in India in 1903. He had British and French ancestry. His mother's French side had been in Burma for a couple of generations, and his father was a relatively old father. Orwell had two elder sisters, and his father was a civil servant in the opium department, believe it or not, because the British Raj cultivated opium and it was sold for recreational purposes. It was only in the 1920s that was outlawed, so it was an important cash cow for the British Empire, sold here, sold overseas. Thomas de Quincey wrote his Confessions of an Opium Eater. Anyway, when Orwell was little, he returned to the United Kingdom with his mother and sisters. I say returned, he'd never been here in the first place. They settled in a small middle-class town in southern England. The father remained out in India to complete his service before he could return on a pension. So that was that. So Orwell showed early academic promise, and he went to St Cyprian's, a prep school just a bit to the west of London. I don't think it exists anymore, and he had a ghastly time there. So he was really, in a sense, middle class, and the other boys were upper middle class or even upper class, and there were the many fine gradations of the class system at the time. He recalled that they used to ask him, "Do your people have a car?" Meaning, does your family have a car? And he would sometimes lie and claim that he did, because he found it so intensely embarrassing to admit that they didn't. Remember, cars had been invented only about 20 years before, so they were mega expensive. It'd be like owning your own private jet these days. The headmaster was a crashing snob who did what he could to curry favour with the local squirearchy. But Orwell was put in for a scholarship, trying to get him a scholarship to Eton, which was only in classics in those days, Latin, ancient Greek, and no other subject. So that was everything, because it was an important part of the school's marketing, as they can say, we got so many Eton scholarships. So boys who were not so academically gifted could go there thinking, wow, there's superb teaching here, look at their honours board. Anyway, so George Orwell, he sat for that, and he actually at school he knew Cyril Connolly, who was at his prep school. Orwell, he later penned a scathing account of his time at St Cyprian's entitled "Such Were the Joys." He loathed it, the cant, the hypocrisy, the overemphasis on games, the nonsense that was muscular Christianity. The headmaster was a flagellomaniac. Just the petty inanities of the class system. Anyway, so he got into Wellington on a scholarship, Wellington College, which is also in Berkshire, and he went there for one term. And then he passed the Eton scholarship. So forget Wellington, he was going to go to Eton. Everybody knew this. It was the absolute pinnacle of the public school system. So he went there to a house called College, which is a house for the King's Scholars, and they put the name KS behind their name. And look, I'm not the only one here on Portobello Road having a gawk at George Orwell's house. So that was that. So he was in college. They put the name KS behind the letters KS behind the name King Scholar, and they have to wear a special gown. You might think that they got grief for being King Scholars. Oh, you don't have enough money to go here. The ordinary way, the oppidans might say, the boys who didn't get scholarships called oppidans, but no, that wasn't the case. So anyway, he was absolutely fed up of academic learning of that nature and wanted to just read for leisure. So he made really no effort. He was lackadaisical, and he performed very poorly. So he was interested in modern literature. The First World War was already on by the time he went up to Eton, and he felt the most withering disdain for this and for chauvinism. He had to join the CCF, Combined Cadet Force, do army training. So he was very anti-establishment this time. But as his time at Eton was drawing to a close, he thought, what was he going to do? He'd already had a taste of sleeping rough one time when he missed his train to get back from a CCF camp. He was very interested in girls. He didn't dabble in homosexuality. Apparently it was rife at the time. And he preferred penning little poems and things like that, and very much into modernist literature. He'd played the wall game for his house college. There's a photo of him. He was very tall, about 6'4". But the thing is, he'd fallen behind academically, doing badly in trials, the school's internal exams. And there was no way he was going to win a scholarship to Oxford or Cambridge, and it was beyond the family's finances for him to go there. Didn't seem to even considered other universities. So that was that. He had to get a job straight away. So he applied to the Burma police, because in Burma, that's now Myanmar, there were police officers who were almost all British, who were commissioned, who had some special training, and then there were the ordinary policemen who were Burmese, who were paid much less. So, but it was a hardship post, so the pay was high, and for someone who was very bourgeois but didn't have much wealth, this was a good option. It was a job for life. Anyway, so he passed that. He did very well in the exams, particularly in French. Not that he needed French out in Burma, but it proved his ability to learn the Burmese language. So he shipped out to Burma when he was 19. And he spent a couple of desultory years there, up country. He loathed it. And he wrote a couple of essays recalling his experiences there, such as shooting an elephant and a hanging, where he ends up expressing his detestation of the death penalty. Anyway, he said of his time in this colony that a colonist wears a mask and his face grows to fit it. It was fascinating to notice that he said, I know this, the British Empire is a good deal better than many of the younger empires which are struggling to supplant it. And that was an allusion to I suppose, well, the Third Reich hadn't even been born, but the Japanese Empire in particular, the Soviet Union. Up until that time, he took no particular interest in politics. He had disdain, I suppose, for the Tory establishment, didn't think the Liberals were much better. But so he was sickened of his police duties, and he was given leave. So every couple of years, they get 6 months leave because the journey back was so long, the voyage, you had to have a few months to make it worthwhile. So he took ship back to Europe, and then he stopped off in France. He got off the ship. He could have completed his journey by train to the northern coast of France and easily cross over to the United Kingdom, but decided he wouldn't. He'd just live in France and he'd work there. Was he working illegally? Presumably he was eligible for French citizenship. He had one French grandparent, and you can read about this in his days down and out down and out in Paris and London, or is it London and Paris, working as a plongeur, washing dishes in some fetid little restaurant in the kitchen, and things like that, and the hardships of ordinary people. And he'd been shielded from this with his relatively privileged upbringing. Later in London, staying in Spikes, which is a homeless shelter, meeting all sorts of ne'er-do-wells, homeless people, alcoholics, the subclinically mentally ill, and met people of the most staggering ignorance, the people who thought Napoleon was still alive and things like that. And he was told that in the 1920s in London, this is a city where it's impossible to starve. Finding a bed for the night is not. So this is when his political opinions began to crystallize, and he began to despise the capitalist system which had brought this all about. Many of these people were soldiers of the First World War. Their lives had been dislocated. They'd suffered this mental torsion, sometimes physical wounds, and here they were, just the flotsam and jetsam of capitalism, just thrown on the scrap heap. So he resolved to do something about it. And this is when he started to identify the Labour Party. In the 1930s, he did various jobs. He was a shopkeeper. He taught in a school. He had no training as a teacher, no degree, but in those days, they would just take you because there are very few people who'd even completed secondary education. He was clearly a highly intelligent man, very widely read. And that was that. Lived here for a while. Stayed with his sisters occasionally. And Down and Out in Paris and London is an absolutely enthralling and rollicking account of his time. But he said he did excise certain details about picking up a trollop and spending the night with her. And sometimes it wasn't quite as rough as he made out, and he stayed with his sister at Christmas. He also wrote The Road to Wigan Pier, an account of really working class life, going to some of the most poverty-stricken communities during the Great Depression and seeing the privation there. What was it like to be a miner in the 30s and things like that. So he also came to abominate communism, seeing how it was socialism gone very badly wrong and was simply grist to the mill of the Tory press. That there were these famines going on in Ukraine, and they were blandly denied, not just by communists, but by some members of the Labour Party, by fellow travellers who weren't red, who were pink. And he said they were going to lie if it was for the cause. They put their heads in the sand. They would blindly deny something that was blatantly true. Walter Taranti, take a bow. So he believed in democratic socialism. The Second World War came, and he worked for the BBC, writing various things. How can I skip over his time in Spain? When the Spanish Civil War broke out, he went out to Spain and he volunteered there. You could read his autobiography of this section of his life, Homage to Catalonia, about fighting there and meeting anarchists and so on, and Trotskyists and Stalinists battling against some of his friends being arrested by Stalinists and presumably ending up before a firing squad. He got shot in the throat but survived, Anyway, he made it back to the United Kingdom, but he came to despise overly florid prose, and we shouldn't go for multi-syllabic words, and we shouldn't be striving to allude to the classics all the time. He said, write in plain English, as ordinary as you can, and just use the words most likely to be understood, and you can do that without making it dull. So that was his style, sort of demotic English, I suppose. So in the Second World War, he reflected a lot on totalitarianism, and then he wrote Animal Farm just after the Second World War. He'd got married. He had one child, a natural child, I think, not adopted. But anyway, Animal Farm is really an allegory about the Russian Revolution, and the pigs obviously represent the leadership of that, and because they're piggish in both senses, and obviously there's Mr. Smith as the farmer, and things like that. Animal farmers in the workers' state. But obviously, eventually, the pigs, the communist leadership, they're in cahoots with the humans, as in the very capitalists they overthrew. And you could not tell man from pig and pig from man. So they started to imitate the people they overthrew, l'ancien régime, and on and on. And there's a bit of the sort of Stalinist, Trotskyist rivalry, and that Raven who's there at the beginning, he could arguably represent Marx, possibly Lenin. So I shan't go into every particular of it, but 1984 is a book he wrote in 1948 in a small island off the Scots coast. So reverse the digits, 48 became 84. But he said it's a warning and not a prophecy of a totalitarian state, and he was worried about the growing, overweening power of the state to surveil us. And now we've got security cameras, and it was a rich irony that there was a security camera on this house here. I'm not sure if it's still there. And thought that there'd be just three massive empires, Eurasia, East Asia, and Oceania. The United Kingdom would end up as Airstrip 1, a little more than an airbase for the United States. There's a burglar alarm, but there's none of this. Some people say Orwell was a bit hypocritical, and during the Second World War he said, well, we must make some sacrifices for the greater good, we must suppress the truth if it's going to undermine our cause, and we must blazon forth lies, likewise, to vindicate our cause. So anyway, he fell ill and he died in 1950. He's buried in Sutton Courtenay, just south of Oxford. His son lived on for many years. He was married twice, I believe. So he was a member of the Church of England, not particularly religious, but he had an Anglican funeral. That is George Orwell, an absolutely scintillating and world-changing author. They didn't publish many works, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, Burmese Days, about his experiences in Myanmar. I can't think of, I don't know of any other locations associated with him. When he was at Eton in college, as in that house, they had a reading room, as they call it, but reading room is actually just where they socialise, those boys. And he bought a book and signed it Eric Blair, that's his real name actually, and left it there. And it wasn't discovered until the 1970s. Someone was deeply chuffed to have discovered it. So Orwell was this nom de plume. It's this minor river in Suffolk. That's where he took it from. All right, that's enough about George Orwell.